He knelt over the dying man, the enemy. Every frontier instinct, every harsh lesson the unforgiving land had taught Caleb, screamed for him to finish it. A quick mercy, or a necessary act of self-preservation. The warrior's blood was a dark stain on the creek bank, his breath a failing whisper. Yet Caleb found his hand reaching not for his knife, but for the canteen at his hip. A single, inexplicable act of compassion in a world that rarely rewarded it. Why would this weathered cowboy, a man who carried the weight of a violent past, risk his own life, his hard-won anonymity, for a man he was supposed to kill? The answer, buried deep beneath layers of grit and regret, would unearth a truth far deadlier than the arrow or the bullet, a truth that threatened to set the entire territory ablaze. This choice, made in the quiet shadows of the wilderness, was the first spark. Caleb was a man attempting to outrun his own shadow, finding a temporary halt near the fledgling township of Redemption Creek. The name was a constant, bitter jest. Redemption Creek itself was a raw scar on the land, populated by souls either escaping a past or gambling on a future carved from dust and hope. Caleb's hands, gnarled and capable, found work easily, mending fences for the quietly observant widow Parsons, whose own unspoken sorrows resonated with his, wrangling lost stock for old Hemlock, a prospector whose dreams had long ago crumbled into the dirt he sifted. He moved with a quiet economy, his words sparse, his voice a low rumble that seldom rose. The townsfolk saw a reliable, if solitary figure, his eyes holding a weariness that spoke of storms weathered far from their valley, a subtle alertness that missed nothing. His true history was a locked vault, the key supposedly lost to the prairie winds. But beneath that carefully maintained surface of a simple cowhand, the instincts of a seasoned survivor, a man once intimately familiar with the cold calculus of violence, remained honed to a razor's edge. He'd register the almost imperceptible shift in a drunk's posture before a clumsy draw, the unnatural stillness of a horse that signaled an unseen watcher, the way a newcomer's gaze lingered too long on the freight office. These were the silent tells of the frontier, invisible to most, but to Caleb, they were as loud as a warning shot. Redemption Creek, for all its aspirations of peace, simmered with unspoken anxieties. Settlers, their eyes fixed on fertile bottomland, edged ever closer to ancestral tribal territories. Rumors of gold strikes in the distant hills fanned the flames of greed, drawing a rougher, more desperate element to the town's saloons and shadows. And beneath it all, the constant, low hum of fear, of the land's sudden furies, of outlaw raids, of the vast, untamed wilderness that could swallow a man whole. Caleb sought only a quiet corner, a place where the ghosts of a former, brutal life might finally fade. Yet, the very land seemed to mirror his inner turmoil, restless and on edge. The cold peacemaker at his hip wasn't a symbol of aggression, but a somber relic of necessity, a heavy habit he yearned to break. His small, isolated cabin, tucked into a fold of the hills, offered a fragile sanctuary. There, on the worn porch steps, as twilight bled across the sky, he would often trace the faint, jagged line of a scar above his left eyebrow, a memento from a time under the command of a man whose name was synonymous with ruthless efficiency. That scar, a phantom ache, served as a constant reminder. The past never truly died. It merely waited. His cultivated quiet was a thin shield over a core of coiled readiness, a vigilance that never truly slept. The shattering of Redemption Creek's brittle peace began not with a volley of gunfire, but with the arrival of a new force, riders whose disciplined movements and cold, empty eyes set them apart from the usual trail-worn travelers. Their leader was a man who seemed to carry winter in his gaze, Captain Flint. The name struck Caleb with the force of a physical blow, a chilling echo from a past he'd shed blood to escape. He hadn't laid eyes on Marcus Flint since the dying embers of the war, since the day Caleb had walked away from Flint's twisted interpretation of order, an order enforced with cold steel and colder hearts. To see him here, in this place Caleb had dared to hope might be a haven, felt like fate twisting a knife. Flint and his men, ex-cavalry by their look and bearing, established a stark, military-style camp just beyond the town's edge. They soon made their presence felt in the Dusty Spur saloon, their voices loud, their talk laced with promises of pacifying the region, of bringing law to the lawless. But their chilling laughter, the predatory glint in their eyes as they requisitioned supplies from the intimidated storekeeper, spoke of a different, more brutal agenda. Caleb recognized it instantly. It was the scent of power wielded without conscience. The townsfolk, cowed, offered no resistance, their resentment a silent, growing pressure beneath the surface. Caleb was near the mercantile, ostensibly examining a worn saddle, his senses tuned to the street, when the sharp, sickening crack of a whip cut through the afternoon air. He turned, his movement fluid, almost imperceptible. Marcus Flint stood over a young farmhand, little more than a boy, who had apparently stumbled into his path. The boy lay whimpering in the dust, clutching his face. A deadly stillness fell. No one moved. No one spoke. Caleb's hand drifted, a mere inch, towards the butt of his Colt. A muscle jumped in his jaw. The familiar ice-water sensation, the prelude to decisive, often violent action, flooded his veins. He forced himself to remain still, his expression unreadable, but inside, a dangerous current was stirring. Flint's gaze, like chips of granite, swept the onlookers, snagging for a brief, dismissive moment on Caleb. There was no overt recognition. Not yet. Years of hard living had altered Caleb's appearance. But a flicker of something, a wolf assessing a potential threat, or perhaps a rival, flared in Flint's eyes before he turned away, prodding the fallen boy with the toe of his boot. That night, the methodical, spaced rhythm of rifle fire echoed from the surrounding hills. Not the chaotic pop of a skirmish, but disciplined volleys. Flint's work. Caleb lay on his bunk, staring into the oppressive darkness of his cabin, the sounds a cold premonition. The peace he had sought was not just threatened, it was already bleeding out. The shadows in his small cabin deepened, mirroring the darkness he felt gathering over Redemption Creek. The question was no longer if trouble would find him, but how he would meet it when it did. In the days that followed, Flint's patrols became a constant, unnerving sight, his men sweeping through the valley with a grim purpose that set teeth on edge. Fearful whispers slithered back to Redemption Creek. Homesteads found smoldering, livestock vanished, wells deliberately poisoned. The stories painted a picture of systematic terror. When the nervous town council, led by the portly Mayor Thompson, dared to question him, Flint, with chilling composure, blamed renegade Indians. He spoke of the absolute necessity of his presence, the unwavering protection his men offered. Listening from the dusty perimeter of the hastily assembled crowd, Caleb heard the unspoken truth in Flint's smooth assurances. The tactics were too precise, too brutal, too familiar. This was Flint's signature style. Create chaos, then present himself as the only salvation. A profound disquiet settled deep within Caleb. The pretense of his quiet, detached existence became impossible to maintain. His solitary rides lengthened, taking him to the valley's edges, his eyes scanning for signs, his old, suppressed instincts now fully awakened. He wasn't seeking conflict, he told himself. He was merely observing, assessing the true nature and scope of Flint's operation. He found what he expected. Tracks of numerous shod horses, moving with tactical precision, not the wandering paths of prospectors or hunters. These tracks invariably led towards Blackwood Canyon, a place held sacred by the local tribe, the people of the Whispering Wind. Hidden deep within a thorny thicket, he discovered evidence of a recent, desperate firefight. Spent .45-70 government cartridges, the kind Flint's ex-cavalryman favored, mingled with the smaller shells of Indian repeaters. The ground was churned, branches snapped. A silent, brutal narrative. One dawn, while checking his sparse trap lines near a secluded stream, a place he valued for its isolation, he saw them, buzzards, dark specks circling patiently against the pale blue canvas of the sky. A cold, familiar dread clenched his gut. He knew, with a certainty that bypassed thought, that this was no animal they were congregating for. The faint, metallic tang of blood, almost lost beneath the scent of damp earth and pine, reached him on the morning breeze. He dismounted his buckskin mare, Bess. Her reins looped over a low branch. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, as he drew his Winchester from its saddle scabbard, the feel of the worn stock a grim comfort. He advanced with the hushed tread of a man long accustomed to moving through hostile territory, every rustle of leaf, every snap of twig, magnified in the preternatural quiet. He saw the Indian longbow first, its polished wood dark against the forest floor, the string severed. Nearby, a quiver lay on its side, arrows scattered like fallen feathers. Then he saw him. Half hidden by a dense screen of wild raspberry bushes, lay a warrior of the whispering wind. He was young, his features sharp and proud even in their current state, his long black hair matted with sweat and grime. Caleb recognized him, Keem. He'd seen him once, months prior, at a strange trading post meeting between tribal elders and nervous town dignitaries. Keem had stood beside an elder, his presence a silent, stoic challenge, his dark eyes missing nothing. Now Keem was dying. A deep, ominous stain was spreading across the buckskin of his shirt, high on his right side. A lung shot, Caleb surmised, or worse. His breathing was a shallow, ragged struggle. A Springfield carbine, the type Flint's men carried, lay a few feet from Keem's outstretched hand, as if dropped in the heat of a desperate defense, or perhaps by one of his attackers. Flint's men. There was no other explanation. The warrior was, by every harsh code of this unforgiving frontier, an enemy. Their peoples were locked in a bitter, often bloody struggle for the same land, the same resources. Mistrust was the air they breathed. Yet, as Caleb looked down at the wounded man, he saw not an abstract adversary, but a young brave, fighting for his home, his way of life, struck down by the very same brutal force Caleb himself had once served, and then reviled. The internal conflict that had been a low simmer within Caleb now erupted into a raging inferno, fueled by a potent cocktail of old guilts and fresh, searing anger. He stood frozen, the Winchester a heavy weight in his hands, the gentle burble of the stream a stark contrast to the storm in his soul. The buzzards circled lower, their shadows passing over them, patient and expectant. The choice, when Caleb made it, wasn't a product of careful deliberation or a weighing of potential consequences. It was an almost violent surge from a place deep within him, a rebellion against the cold-blooded cruelty of men like Marcus Flint, a rejection of the senseless slaughter they perpetuated. It was an echo of a younger Caleb, a man who had once dared to believe in justice before the war, and Flint had systematically tried to extinguish that belief. He laid his Winchester carefully on the ground, within easy reach, and knelt beside Keem. His hands, accustomed to the rough work of the frontier, were surprisingly deft as he gently parted the torn buckskin to examine the wound. It was grievous, a ragged puncture oozing dark blood. Without immediate and skilled aid, it was a death sentence. To leave him was to condemn him to a slow, agonizing end, a feast for the scavengers. To finish him, the thought brought a wave of revulsion. It was too close to an execution, a grim reminder of orders he'd once been given, orders he had defied, costing him dearly. He had his canteen, still half full of fresh water, a roll of clean linen strips he always carried in his saddlebags, and a grim, practical knowledge of treating battlefield wounds, skills he had prayed he would never need again. Keem's eyes, which had been glazed with pain and drifting towards unconsciousness, suddenly snapped open, focusing on Caleb with a startling, fierce intensity. A raw spark of hatred ignited in their depths, quickly followed by a dawning, wary confusion. He grunted, a low sound of agony and supreme effort, and his hand twitched, feebly attempting to reach a knife sheathed at his belt. His arm fell back useless. "Save your strength," Caleb said, his voice low, surprisingly gentle. He worked with focused efficiency, tearing a strip from the linen, soaking it with water, and beginning to carefully clean the dirt and congealed blood from around the wound. Keem flinched, his breath hissing sharply through clenched teeth, but he made no sound. His dark eyes, burning with a mixture of pain, suspicion, and a dawning, reluctant curiosity, never left Caleb's face, tracking his every movement. Every sound in the surrounding woods, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a jay, the snap of a twig under some unseen creature's foot, seemed amplified, echoing in the charged silence. Caleb was acutely, dangerously aware of their exposure. He was out in the open, a clear target. Keem's people, if they were searching for their fallen comrade, could appear at any moment. Flint's men, if they were sweeping the area to confirm their kills or hunt for survivors, could stumble upon them. He was caught between two fires, both potentially lethal. The sun climbed, its rays filtering through the cottonwood leaves, painting dappled patterns on the forest floor. Hours crawled by in a haze of concentrated effort and knife-edge tension. Caleb managed to slow the bleeding, packing the wound tightly with the linen. He shared his remaining water, carefully tilting the canteen to Keem's cracked lips, coaxing a few precious drops between them. The warrior drank, his gaze still fixed on Caleb, unwavering, suspicious. Yet there was a subtle shift, a lessening of the pure animosity, replaced by a profound, watchful stillness. He remained silent, hoarding his dwindling strength. As dusk began to bleed across the western sky, painting the clouds in hues of blood orange and deep violet, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees, Caleb knew they couldn't remain by the stream. He couldn't move Keem far in his current state, but to leave him here overnight was unthinkable. He needed better cover, a defensible position, a place where Keem might have a fragile chance. He recalled an old, abandoned trapper's lean-to, deeper in the woods, well off any known trail, almost swallowed by the encroaching wilderness. It wasn't much, but it was something. With immense effort, using Keem's own sturdy blanket and two long, straight limbs he cut from a nearby pine, he fashioned a crude travois. Transferring Keem onto it was an agonizing process. The warrior was a dead weight, groaning softly with each jolting movement, his face ashen and beaded with cold sweat. Caleb's own muscles protested, the strain burning through him. He felt hunted, the deepening shadows around them seeming to rive with unseen watchers, every sound a potential herald of discovery. Then he heard it, the distinct, piercing cry of a hawk, high and clear in the twilight air. A beat of silence, then an answering call, from a different direction. Signals. Keem's eyes, which had been closed against the pain, flickered open. A new light, faint but unmistakable, shone within them. Was it a glimmer of hope? Or was it a silent warning to Caleb that his act of mercy was about to be discovered by those who might interpret it as anything but? The tension coiled tighter, a cold knot in Caleb's stomach. They reached the derelict-lined cabin as true darkness enveloped the woods, the moon a mere sliver obscured by a thick blanket of clouds. The cabin was little more than a skeleton of decaying logs, its roof sagging precariously, but it offered a modicum of shelter from the biting night air and, more crucially, concealment from prying eyes. The air inside was heavy with the scent of damp earth, rotting wood, and the faint, lingering aroma of old wood smoke. Caleb gently eased Keem from the travois, propping him carefully against the most intact section of the log wall, using his own saddle blanket for padding. His movements were measured, efficient, honed by years spent in harsh and unforgiving environments. He then set about coaxing a small, almost smokeless fire to life in the cabin's crumbling stone hearth, using dry leaves, twigs, and shavings he meticulously gathered. Even a little warmth could mean the difference between life and death. Keem watched him, his dark eyes reflecting the nascent flames, luminous and unervingly perceptive in the flickering light. The silence in the small, ruined space stretched, taut and heavy, broken only by the hesitant crackle of the fire and Keem's shallow, labored breathing. Finally, the warrior spoke. His voice was a mere rasp, weak and strained, but it carried clearly in the stillness. "Why?" It was the question that had hung unspoken between them since Caleb had first knelt beside him at the stream. The question Caleb had been grappling with himself. Caleb paused, a small piece of kindling in his hand. He stared into the dancing flames for a long moment, the firelight casting shifting shadows across his own weary, grim features. "Flint," he said at last, the name expelled like a shard of glass. "He's a sickness on this land. No man deserves to die by his hand, or for his reasons." Keem's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something, understanding, perhaps even a grim recognition, igniting in their depths. "You know this, Flint?" Caleb nodded slowly, his silhouette large and distorted on the rough-hewn logs behind him. "I rode with him. A lifetime ago. Before I truly understood the darkness he carried." He offered no further explanation, no details of the war, of the mounting disillusionment, of the final, brutal incident that had shattered his loyalty and sent him walking away. A different kind of silence descended, thick with shared, though opposing, experiences of Flint's cruelty. Then Keem spoke again, a new, desperate urgency infusing his weakened voice. "He seeks more than land, more than scalps." He paused, gathering his scarce strength. "He seeks the Sunstone." Caleb looked at him, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Sunstone? What is that?" Keem took a ragged, painful breath, his gaze burning with intensity. He began to explain, his words halting at first, then gaining a desperate fluency. The Sunstone, he revealed, was a sacred relic to his people, the people of the Whispering Wind. It was not merely a rock. It was a spiritual touchstone, a conduit to their ancestors, the very heart of their most sacred ceremonies. But Keem continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Ancient legends also spoke of the Sunstone marking the hidden entrance to rich gold deposits within their sacred mountain, a place fiercely guarded, forbidden to all outsiders. Flint wasn't just pacifying the territory with indiscriminate violence. He wasn't just waging a war of attrition against the tribes. He was on a ruthless, methodical treasure hunt, using the escalating conflict as a smokescreen for his insatiable greed. "He has a map," Keem breathed, his eyes darting towards the cabin's dark, gaping doorway as if Flint himself might suddenly materialize from the shadows. "Taken from a shaman, one of our wisest elders. His men they tortured and killed him for it." Suddenly, Flint's seemingly random acts of brutality, his systematic clearing of tribal lands, his patrols pushing ever deeper into forbidden territories, coalesced into a horrifying, coherent pattern. It wasn't mindless savagery. It was a calculated, avaricious campaign. Then Keem revealed something more, something that sent a chill of horrified understanding through Caleb. Keem's own war party, the one ambushed and decimated, hadn't been on a simple defensive patrol. They had received intelligence that Flint was perilously close to the sacred site. They had launched a desperate attempt to intercept Flint's patrol, to protect the Sunstone and the mountain at all costs. Keem himself, in the chaotic moments before he was shot, had caught a fleeting glimpse of the map Flint carried. He described a unique, unmistakable landmark depicted on it, a feature marking the supposed entrance to the hidden gold, a solitary, ancient pine, its massive trunk bleached white by sun and storm, its upper branches twisted and blackened by a lightning strike, resembling a colossal, skeletal claw reaching for the sky. Caleb's blood ran cold. He knew that tree. He had passed it countless times on his solitary rides. It stood sentinel on a high, windswept ridge overlooking the entire valley. And more critically, it was dangerously close to the headwaters of Redemption Creek, the town's sole, irreplaceable source of fresh water. If Flint found gold there, if he began any kind of large-scale mining operation, he would inevitably destroy the delicate ecosystem of the ridge. He would foul the creek, poison the water, rendering the valley uninhabitable, turning Redemption Creek into a ghost town. He would displace everyone, settler and native alike, all for his personal enrichment. The enemy of his enemy, the man Caleb had saved, driven by a complex mix of defiance, pity, and a deep-seated yearning for some form of personal atonement, now held the key to the survival of not just his own tribe, but of Caleb, of Redemption Creek, of every soul in the valley. Saving Keem was no longer a secret act of mercy. It had become an act of communal self-preservation, a desperate, imperative necessity. The stakes had just escalated beyond anything Caleb could have imagined. "We have to stop him," Caleb stated, the words emerging raw and absolute, his voice infused with a new, hard urgency. The weariness was still there, etched into his features, but now it was overlaid with a steely, unyielding resolve. Keem, despite his debilitating weakness, nodded, a grim, mutual understanding reflected in his pain-filled eyes. "My warriors, they will fight. They will die to protect the sacred mountain. But Flint has many men, many repeating rifles. And now, because of that stolen map, he knows where to strike." Caleb's mind raced, sifting through possibilities, calculating desperate odds. Flint, emboldened by his recent successes and the acquisition of the map, would likely move on the lightning-struck pine swiftly, probably under the assumption that he had broken the back of any organized tribal resistance. He would be arrogant, overconfident. "Your warriors," Caleb began, thinking aloud. "Can they create a significant diversion? Something loud, something convincing enough to draw the main body of Flint's force away from that ridge, away from the sacred pine?" Keem considered this, his brow furrowed in intense concentration despite the fever that glazed his eyes. "Perhaps, if I can reach them, if they will trust you." He gestured weakly towards Caleb with his uninjured arm. That was the precipice. Would Keem's people, understandably embittered and suspicious, trust an outsider, a white man, especially one who had, however long ago, ridden under a banner similar to the one now hunting them? Caleb met Keem's gaze directly, his own unwavering. "I'll get you to them, or at least close enough for you to make contact. We don't have much time." The journey through the moonless, treacherous night was a living nightmare. Caleb, half carrying, half dragging the delirious, fever-racked Keem, navigated by instinct and Keem's whispered, fragmented directions. Keem, lapsing in and out of consciousness, somehow found the strength to guide him along ancient, hidden game trails and through dense thickets that Caleb, despite his familiarity with the local terrain, had never known existed. They evaded Flint's patrols by a combination of Keem's innate understanding of the land's rhythms and Caleb's own hard-won skills in stealth and evasion. Miraculously, just as the first, pale tendrils of dawn began to probe the eastern horizon, they reached the heavily concealed perimeter of the Whispering Wind's temporary encampment. It was nestled deep within a labyrinth of rocky arroyos and dense ponderosa stands, virtually invisible to the untrained eye. Keem, summoning a final, desperate reserve of strength, emitted a specific, low bird call, a sound Caleb would have dismissed as natural. Within moments, silent, shadowy figures materialized from the rocks and trees, like spirits of the forest, their weapons, bows, lances, a few battered trade muskets, held at the ready. Their faces were granite-hard, their eyes filled with a potent mixture of grief, suspicion, and simmering hostility as they took in the sight of Caleb, supporting one of their grievously wounded warriors. The tension was a drawn bowstring, vibrating with unspoken threats in the cold, pre-dawn air. Keem spoke rapidly in his native tongue, his voice weak, but carrying an undeniable urgency and authority. He gestured towards Caleb, then to his own blood-soaked bandage, his words a torrent of explanation, of appeal. The warrior's eyes, dark and piercing, remained fixed on Caleb, unblinking, weighing, judging. Then Keem, his voice dropping, spoke of Flint, of the stolen map, of the imminent, catastrophic threat to the Sunstone and their sacred mountain. He finished, swaying with exhaustion, leaning heavily against Caleb for support. An elder, his face a deeply etched chronicle of seasons and sorrows, his long hair streaked with venerable white, stepped forward from the assembled warriors. His gaze was like a physical force, seeming to penetrate Caleb's carefully constructed defenses, to peer directly into his soul. He studied Caleb for a long, agonizingly silent moment, a moment that stretched into an eternity. Finally, the elder spoke, his voice deep and resonant, in heavily accented but understandable English. "You, white man, you fight Flint." Caleb met his piercing gaze, without flinching. "He threatens my home too," he said, his voice quiet but imbued with an unshakable conviction. "And no man, red or white, should possess that much greed, or spill that much innocent blood to feed it." The elder continued to stare. Then, with slow, deliberate gravity, he nodded once. An alliance as fragile and precious as a desert spring, born of shared desperation and a common, implacable enemy, was forged in the cold light of that uncertain dawn. The plan they hastily conceived was audacious, bordering on suicidal. Keem's warriors, though severely outnumbered and outgunned by Flint's well-armed force, would launch a fierce, highly visible attack on Flint's main encampment, a location Keem knew was situated in a more open, tactically vulnerable position. The objective: to draw out the bulk of Flint's forces, to create a believable impression that the tribe was making a final, desperate, all-out stand. Meanwhile, Caleb, accompanied by a handful of the tribe's most skilled and stealthy scouts, warriors who could move through the wilderness like smoke on the wind, would use the chaos of the diversion as cover. Their mission: to reach the high ridge, to find the lightning-struck pine, and there, to intercept Flint himself. They gambled that Flint, arrogant and believing the primary threat neutralized, would go to the sacred site with only a small, trusted escort to claim his prize. They had to retrieve the map, and if the opportunity arose, to capture or stop Flint permanently. The fate of the valley hung in the balance. The confrontation erupted beneath the stark, skeletal branches of the ancient, lightning-scarred pine. The air on the ridge was thin, carrying the faint, distant pop-pop-pop of gunfire and the ululating war cries from the diversionary attack raging far below in the valley. Flint, just as they had desperately hoped, was there. He was flanked by a half-dozen of his most hardened, brutal-looking men. He was hunched over, gloating, studying the stolen map spread out on a flat slab of granite, a look of feverish, avaricious excitement gleaming in his cold eyes as his finger traced a line on the parchment. Caleb and the warriors, having approached using every gully, every rock outcrop, every shadow for concealment, moved like phantoms through the scree and stunted, wind-twisted pines. The attack was a silent, deadly explosion of motion. Arrows, loosed by unseen bowmen, hissed through the thin air with lethal precision, thudding into two of Flint's unsuspecting guards. They crumpled without a sound, their surprise frozen on their faces. Flint whirled, his hand a blur as it darted to the heavy Colt revolver holstered at his side, his face contorting from surprise to murderous rage as he saw Caleb step out from behind a jagged boulder, Winchester leveled steady. "You!" Flint snarled, the word a venomous epithet. Recognition, followed by a dawning, furious understanding of betrayal, blazed in his icy eyes. "Traitor!" "Justice, Flint," Caleb gritted out, his voice low, cold, and carrying the weight of old scores. "Something you've never understood." His Winchester spat flame and lead, the shot aimed with deadly intent. The firefight was short, desperate, and incredibly violent. Flint was a dangerous, cornered animal, his pistol barking rapidly, forcing Caleb and the warriors to seek cover behind the unforgiving rocks. Bullets ricocheted with angry whines, kicking up spurts of dust and stone chips. But Caleb was no longer fighting merely for his own survival. He was fighting for Redemption Creek, for the proud, besieged people Keem represented, for a sliver of his own long-lost, battered honor. One of the young warriors, with a piercing, defiant war cry, launched himself from an overhanging ledge directly at Flint, armed only with a long knife. He was cut down in midair by a blast from one of Flint's remaining men, but his courageous, suicidal sacrifice was not in vain. For one critical, split second, the diversion drew Flint's attention, his gun swiveling. In that infinitesimal opening, Caleb sighted with cold precision and squeezed the trigger. His bullet found its mark. Flint cried out, a raw, strangled sound of agony and disbelief, staggering backward, clutching his right shoulder, his pistol clattering onto the dusty, blood-spattered ground. The remaining raiders, seeing their formidable leader fall, finding themselves suddenly and silently surrounded by the grim, deadly warriors who seemed to materialize from the very earth and stones, threw down their weapons, their faces chalk-white with terror. The map, lying forgotten on the flat rock where Flint had so eagerly studied it, was swiftly and reverently retrieved by one of the scouts. Flint, wounded, disarmed, and utterly defeated, his face a contorted mask of impotent fury and disbelief, was bound securely with his own gun belt. His brutal reign of terror, built on fear, bloodshed, and insatiable greed, had ended on this lonely, windswept ridge. The sun, now climbing higher, finally broke through the lingering morning mist, bathing the scene in a clear, unwavering, and almost cleansing light. The aftermath unfolded in a strange, surreal quiet, a profound exhaustion settling over the ridge, tinged with the bitter tang of gunpowder and the quiet, bone-deep satisfaction of a victory hard won. Keem's warriors, their faces stoic and unreadable, took charge of the glowering, defeated Marcus Flint and his captured men. Justice in these high, wild lands, under the ancient laws of the Whispering Wind, would be meted out. Caleb didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. The immediate, overwhelming threat had been neutralized. The sacred sunstone, and the mountain that cradled it, remained inviolate, safe from desecration. As the sun began to cast a warmer, more benevolent golden glow over the valley, stretching out below, the elder warrior, the one whose piercing gaze had first challenged Caleb, approached him. The distant sounds of the battle had long since died away. Keem's diversion, though costly, had been successful, and word of Flint's capture was likely already spreading like wildfire among his demoralized, scattered forces. The elder carried a burnished clay waterskin, which he offered to Caleb with a slow, grave inclination of his head. "You fought with honor, Caleb walks quietly," the elder said, his voice deep, using the name the tribe had evidently bestowed upon Caleb. His English remained fragmented, but his meaning was clear, his respect palpable. "Our lands and our people will remember this day. You have earned our trust." Caleb simply nodded, his throat too tight for words, accepting the waterskin and taking a long, deep draught of the cool, clear water. The weariness was a crushing weight on his shoulders, but it was a different kind of weariness now. Not the soul-gnawing fatigue of despair and a haunted past, but the clean, honest exhaustion of a battle fought, and won for a just and necessary cause. He rode back into Redemption Creek later that day, alone, leading his faithful mare, Bess. He was covered in dust, grime, and the lingering scent of battle, his clothes torn and stained, but he sat straighter in the saddle, a new, quiet light in his weary eyes. News, as it always did on the frontier, traveled faster than a prairie fire, carried on the wind, in hushed whispers, and in the suddenly bolder demeanor of the townsfolk. Snippets of the fierce fight on the ridge, of Flint's unexpected and dramatic downfall, of the pivotal, astonishing role played by the quiet, solitary cowboy who mended fences and mostly kept to himself, began to circulate through the dusty streets and crowded saloon. The townsfolk, those who had cowered and muttered under Flint's oppressive shadow, now looked at Caleb with a newfound, open respect, a dawning, almost awed understanding. There was far more to this quiet, watchful man than any of them had ever guessed. The man they had dismissed as a mere drifter, perhaps running from some dark chapter in his past, possessed a core of unyielding steel, a hidden wellspring of courage and capability they hadn't perceived. Caleb, true to his nature, didn't speak of what had transpired on that high ridge, not in any detail. He deflected the townsfolk's curious questions with his customary brevity, his gaze distant, letting the burgeoning rumors take their own course. But the oppressive darkness that Flint and his men had cast over Redemption Creek had lifted as surely and as visibly as the morning mist burning off the valley floor. The insidious threat to their water, to their homes, to their very future in this fragile settlement, was gone. Caleb continued to live in his secluded cabin in the quiet hollow. He still valued his solitude, still preferred the company of the wind and the stars. But he was no longer just an anonymous drifter in their eyes, nor, more importantly, in his own. He had found a measure of hard-won peace, not by successfully outrunning his past, but by turning to confront a new, virulent manifestation of it, by choosing compassion in the face of ingrained enmity, by choosing decisive action over passive regret. He and Keem, the young warrior whose life he had inexplicably saved by that hidden stream, would occasionally meet in the months that followed, not in secret, but not for public display either. Usually by that same stream, the waters now flowing clear, the place transformed from a site of potential death to one of shared memory and unspoken understanding. They wouldn't say much. Words between them were often superfluous. They were two men from vastly different worlds, once designated enemies by circumstance and prejudice, now bound by the indelible experience of having faced oblivion together and, against all conceivable odds, having chosen life, having fought side by side against a common, consuming darkness. The frontier remained a harsh, unforgiving canvas. Greed and violence would always be predators stalking its edges. But for a precious, hard-fought time, in this small, dusty corner of the vast, untamed wilderness, a fragile, unexpected accord had taken root, watered by courage, by sacrifice, and by a single, transformative act of mercy. Caleb knew the ghosts of his past would never entirely depart. They were woven into the fabric of his being, as indelible as the faded scar above his eye. But now they walked a little softer beside him, their accusatory whispers often lost in the gentle murmur of the stream, the sigh of the wind through the ponderosa pines, and the quiet, persistent, and now believable hope of a new, cleaner dawn. He had risked death to save an enemy, and in doing so, he had, perhaps finally, truly begun to save himself.